One of the greatest pieces of American media ever made is a mob drama made by David Chase in the 2000s, The Sopranos. The show follows James Gandolfini, who plays the iconic New Jersey mobster Tony Soprano. The series is one of the first American shows exploring the figure of the anti-hero, starting the process that led to later characters like Walter White and Tywin Lannister. By the 2000s, the mob genre had already been well explored in film and media, so Chase went in a new direction with it. The Sopranos first, as its opening lines state, is about the mob in its last days. With the rise of RICO and DNA databases for crime, it was becoming increasingly untenable to remain a mobster. The show explores the new generation, the generation of Tony, who joined the mafia and inherited the fruits of the classic mobsters, the generation of figures like his father Johnny Soprano and his uncle Corrado. Living in a mansion in the suburbs, the series shows the fruits of privilege that Tony enjoys. Chase moved the show from New York to New Jersey, wanting to explore the mafia in a new environment. Chase took the concept of the De Cavalcante family of New Jersey and developed it, exploring how the mafia might function in a life outside the city. Inspired by his own relationship with his mother and his own experience in therapy, Chase conceived of the show as a daydream about a mobster who struggled with similar challenges as he did. Central elements of the show include Tony's experiences with his mother Livia, who has borderline personality disorder, and his visits to therapist Jennifer Melfi, something Tony does even though it breaks the mafia code of omerta. Tony's visits to Melfi make up a huge part of the show. The Sopranos is really about the psychology of Tony and the psychology of being a criminal. The show examines Tony's complex and emotional relationships with crime, guilt, sex, and religion. The show wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of storytelling. In addition to using Tony's meetings with a psychiatrist to explore his subconscious, The Sopranos makes ample use of dreams and the supernatural as a way of delving into the protagonist's mind. While Tony does mundane activities in his dreams, like talk with friends and drive, they push the limits of the visual medium and explore experimental symbolism. In a show about mob hits and extortion, in his dreams, Tony drives in a Fiat, sits with his bald deceased capo, and envisions otherworldly images like the butterfly. Consistent with real dreams, Tony's are often surreal and uncanny, and include continuity jumps from one scene to another. While the symbolism of his dreams is meant to be baffling, at the same time they can be interpreted if one looks at them holistically. In one scene, for example, Tony rides a horse in his house, which constitutes a multi-layered symbol. It's first a projection of the race animal, Piamai, who Tony suspects was killed by Ralphie for insurance money. Tony rides the horse in his house before his wife Carmela, played by Edie Falco, admonishes him. A double entendre. She tells him not to bring his horse in here, referring to the sexual affairs Tony has, which disrupt his domestic life and damage his relationship with Carmela. Tony's dreams help us in our psychoanalysis of the character, showing the influence of Sigmund Freud. In his book on the interpretation of dreams, Freud argued that our dreams are a projection of the subconscious and portray our deepest desires, frustrations, and insecurities. True to this, Tony's dreams help us unpack his history and trauma. We learn the origin of his panic attacks, the childhood realization that his father made his livelihood and life from crime. Tony's dreams explore his Catholic guilt, and they also explore the domains of ghosts and the supernatural. One of the first dreams of Tony happens early in the show. While visiting Dr. Melfi, he explains he dreamed of the ducks who landed in his pool. Previously, while sitting in the backyard, a family of mallards came and made themselves home in Tony's swimming pool. Tony is enthralled at the beauty of these animals coming to visit him. The ducks represent the natural world, the beauty of nature, and Tony's innocence. Things he lost since he joined the mob, compromised his morals, and became an extortionist and a murderer. The duck's ability to fly represents a liberation Tony lacks, since he's no longer able to exit the mob life voluntarily. Dr. Melfi unpacks the dream with Tony and uses Freudian analysis to understand it. In his dream, the ducks take Tony's penis and fly away. Since phallic symbols represent agency and power, Melfi explains this represents the powerlessness he feels about his life. Though Tony has the ability to kill, oppress, and live a life of material happiness, with an apparent total moral liberty, he also feels like a slave to an immoral and unjust life, which internally makes him feel weak and unvital. At the end of the series, Tony dumps asbestos on the ducks on the Jersey Shore, showing how the mob life and its dark morality has slowly swallowed him up over the show. Some argue Tony becomes a psychopath, having buried his humanity under layers of callousness. The ducks are the first use of dreams to give us access to Tony's subconscious. Salvatore Big Pussy Bonpensiero, who got his name from being a cat burglar, was one of Tony's oldest friends in the mafia. Pussy betrayed the family and became an FBI informant. Captured for selling heroin and facing 30 years to life in prison, and with his son's college education and future on the line, he decided to become a federal asset. David Chase discussed this episode, knowing he had to have Tony realize Pussy was an informant. This was something Tony subconsciously knew for a long time, but lived in denial about. Chase didn't want to execute Tony's realization in a cliched way, simply seeing Pussy's recording box and ordering a hit. So in an experimental way, Chase chose to use dreams in the subconscious to bring Tony to his realization. In the episode, Tony goes to visit 2 restaurants, his friend Artie Bucco's Italian restaurant where he has seafood, and to an Indian restaurant. While dining, Bonpensiero explains one of the mob's scams, the calling card scam to Furio Junta. As Pussy does this, Tony looks at his friend with concern, unsure of why he has to unpack it with such an intense amount of detail. Tony smiles and goes on with his evening, but it's just one more red flag of Pussy's treason that Tony is forced to rationalize and not notice. Realistically, only someone wearing a recording device would spill out the crime in such detail. A season ago, Tony had been warned of Bonpensiero being compromised as an informant, but failed to believe it, eliminating another captain who was collaborating instead. During this period when Tony strongly suspected Pussy, he visited him at home and offered him an out, a way to negotiate and come back from collaborating. At this time, Pussy refuses and denies he's an informant, and Tony goes on and convinces himself that he's innocent. After going home from the Indian restaurant, Tony has the first of his strange dreams. He wakes and returns to sleep many times during the night, resulting in a long series of dreams, the longest in the series, which give us a look into his psyche with unique insight. Tony first meets with his crew at the shore. He talks with Polly, Christopher, and who he thinks is Patsy. On closer inspection, he learns it's Philly, Patsy's brother, he ordered killed for mocking his going to a psychiatrist. Philly shows Tony the gunshot wound to his head which killed him. This expresses the guilt Tony has for doing this, and the subliminal fear he has that Patsy will seek revenge, one of the ways Soprano's viewers interpret the final episode. Tony douses himself with gasoline and sets himself on fire, imitating the self-immolation done by the monks protesting the Vietnam War. This act of self-destruction may express the internalized fear he has for allowing an informant to remain alive inside his family. Tony awakens, depressed and nihilistic, recriminating himself and repeating the fatalistic line of his mother, "It's all a big nothing." As he stirs, though, he becomes physically ill and realizes he's suffering from a physical illness as much as he is a psychological one. Leaving to vomit and use the toilet, he returns to sleep when he can, suffering a night of food poisoning with diarrhea, fever, and nightmares. The episode ultimately works him through his subconscious and forces him to confront the fact that his oldest friend, Big Pussy Bonpensiero, has become an informant for the FBI. Tony dreams of Silvio, dressed as Al Pacino and doing his impersonation of him. He gives the Godfather, quote, "Our true enemy is yet to reveal himself," which causes Tony to laugh. At the same time, the line shows Tony's subconscious trying to warn him. Tony has a false awakening where he meets with Melfi in her office. She listens to him intently, her posture showing her physical attraction to him. She then morphs into Gloria Trillo, the two characters being conflated, showing Tony's confusion and sexual frustration. Things from real life leak into Tony's dreams. Suffering from diarrhea, in one dream, Furio hands him a roll of toilet paper. He meets with Melfi again, conflating his desire to have sex with her with his suspicion about Bonpensiero. Polly appears in one dream, annoying Tony with his idiosyncrasies and provoking Tony to shoot him. Ultimately, Tony has a dream of the shore, seeing a fish with Bonpensiero's voice. He tells Tony that he's been working for the government. These guys on either side of me, they're asleep, he says. Tony tells him not to say it out loud, referring to how hurtful it is for him. Pussy refers to the fish on either side of him as asleep, showing how oblivious everyone in the family is to his true nature. The fish symbol itself refers to Bonpensiero's fate as sleeping with the fishes. Visiting Pussy's house the next day, Tony looks in one of the drawers casually and finds the microphone and recording device given to him by the government, confirming what he suspected for over a year. Asking him to help him buy a boat, Pussy goes to the pier with Tony and Silvio. On the way there, Tony nods off in a pleasant dream, imagining himself sitting with his family, everyone happy as Meadow talks about her acceptance to university. Tony awakens in the real world, living a nightmare where he has to kill one of his oldest friends. Beside him, Silvio takes a drink, equally emotionally affected. I think subliminally, Pussy knows they're going to kill him. He agrees to get on the boat alone with them without the cellar, and broods at the back of the ship by himself as they go out to sea. They confront him with all his lies and he confesses before they execute their friend and dispose of him. One of the most unique and surreal sequences in The Sopranos happens during his coma after he's shot by Corrado. Tony spends much of season 6 in the hospital, unconscious and on the verge of death. While in the hospital, Tony has a long hallucination. He imagines himself as a salesman for a defense contractor who has gone on a long business trip. Set to meet with a general at a seminar, Tony finds himself unable to do so due to having lost his wallet and briefcase. Stranded, Tony learns that while he was at a bar, he accidentally traded identification with someone else, a Kevin Finnerty who resembles him. In the sequence, Tony has also lost his Jersey accent, making his speech sound more like Gandolfini does in real life. Tony meets a woman, maybe someone else in their own coma, and gets close to an amorous encounter with her before messing it up. Elements of his real self leak into the dream. Not consummating their relationship, he laments his unhappy monogamy. It seems if Tony lived a happy life as a civilian, then his lack of sexual encounters would have been his one source of regret. Tony tries to get back home, but struggles to do so. He calls his family for help. Like in reality, his son and daughter sound like Anthony Jr. and Meadow, but his wife sounds more like Charmaine, Artie's wife, than Carmela, something he had once fantasized about. His wife sympathizes with him and tries to offer help to get him back home. Forced to use a fake credit card to pay for a hotel, Tony is accosted by 2 Buddhist monks who mistake him for Finnerty. The monks say he sold them a false heater. He'll face the consequences for his scam. Tony goes to visit the monks and hope they can connect him with Finnerty, but they just laugh at him and tell him to come to terms with his crime. Tony becomes increasingly confused. After falling down a stairway, he ends up even more perplexed after a doctor in his dream gives him a diagnosis of dementia. Who am I, he asks, and where am I going? He ultimately finds a pamphlet for the Finnerty family reunion. Held in a big house that resembles Uncle Pat's, Tony is greeted by his deceased cousin, Tony Blundetto, played by Steve Buscemi, who offers to take his briefcase from him. Representing his worldly life, his identity, and his memories, Tony is reticent about letting it go. My whole life's in there, he says. While the party in the house looks warm and inviting, Tony hesitates. The outline of his mother, a shrouded black figure, waits for him inside. From the tree line, a mysterious voice emerges, a young girl calling out for her father. Tony resists the invitation to go in the house and holds on to his briefcase, despite his cousin's insistence in taking it. Tony ultimately reawakens in the hospital, returned to life. The Finnerty sequence can be interpreted in a number of ways. It can be seen as a hallucination, a disturbance of the brain had by someone as they approach death. Given its similarity to the show's dream sequences, this is a fair interpretation. The other way to view it is as a near-death experience. It's a transition for Tony as he slowly leaves his physical life behind and prepares for his entrance to the other world. This view is consistent with the other supernatural elements shown on The Sopranos, like the appearances of Pussy's ghost and Polly's vision of the Virgin Mary. One of the first images we see when Tony finds himself at the bar is of the wildfires that have broken out on the Californian coast. When Tony asks the barkeep how Costa Mesa is, he replies that it's dead there. This symbolism suggests hell as a potential fate for Tony. Tony is in a kind of waiting room for the afterlife, like that described by Bob Monroe, the vision of flames on the television potentially showing his future. Earlier in the show, Carmela and Melfi both asked Tony where he thought he was going in the afterlife. Having internalized the Catholic teachings of right and wrong, Tony is agitated by the question, but rationalizes that as a mobster he's a kind of soldier, and soldiers don't go to hell. Carmela herself morally deflects the material benefit she's gained from Tony's crimes, asserting herself as headed to heaven while Tony goes to hell. Throughout his coma, Tony struggles with his identity and sense of self. Having been mistaken by the monks, rejected for not having an ID, and being diagnosed with memory loss by the doctors, he becomes uncertain of who he is. This might allude to Plato's parable of the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness in the afterlife. In ancient Greek mythology, souls drink from this river and get amnesia, forgetting their previous lives before they return to Earth for a new incarnation in the process of metempsychosis. The name Kevin Finnerty contributes to this, implying that in death, Tony may be headed to infinity, to a new experience where his sense of being a limited human being may no longer be applicable. In Tony's dreams, he usually interacts with figures from life, like Carmela and Melfi. In his coma dream, however, all the characters are either new, like the monks, salespeople, and barkeep, or if they are people Tony does know, they're people from his life who have died. Interestingly, Tony doesn't recognize his cousin or his mother in the dream, showing a state of dissociation, or the lack of self-consciousness we have when we're asleep. It may be that if there is a continuity of self after death, it could be like this, with consciousness continuing, but us losing self-awareness and forgetting who we are. The afterlife occurs elsewhere in The Sopranos. Another character, Christopher, has his own near-death experience, which parallels Tony's in many ways. In Season 2, Christopher is gunned down in a parking lot by two of his associates, Matt Bevilacqua and Sean Gismonte, who falsely think the act will give them increased credibility in the mafia and win them the favor of Richie Aprile. Hospitalized, Christopher falls into a coma, and like Tony, oscillates on the verge of death. Tony seeks retribution for Christopher, trying to kill a family member is punishable by death, while Adriana laments the fate of her fiancé. Carmela prays contritely for her nephew's recovery, and also prays Christopher repent his sins if he recovers. Christopher miraculously returns to consciousness, and when he sees Polly and Tony, he recounts what he experienced. He says he went to hell in the afterlife, saw the tunnel and the white light. He says he went to an Irish bar where his father, Mikey Palmisi, and Brendan Filoni are. He says they were gambling with the Irish on a permanent St. Patrick's Day, and the Irish were winning every roll. He also says Mikey gave him a message to give to Tony and Polly. The simple line, 3 o'clock. Are we meant to interpret Christopher's vision as real? Or like Tony, is it a product of his Catholic upbringing, a consequence of his internalized guilt, juxtaposed with his life in the mob? Is it a subliminal product of his underlying belief in divine justice? While Polly questions the effect the hospital drugs are having on Christopher, he takes his message from the other side very seriously. Polly becomes disturbed when he tries to sleep, running Christopher's story over and over again in his mind. He becomes extremely superstitious of 3 o'clock, sitting alert at 3 a.m. whenever the time arrives. In contrast to Polly, Tony dismisses Christopher's story, attributing it to a dream, and tells his nephew to rest and stop worrying about hell. Polly follows up with Christopher, though, asking for more information. Christopher explains that every night the men in the bar are killed in the same way they were killed in life, as a part of their punishment. Polly then starts rationalizing. Going on about the heat, Polly insists Christopher wasn't in hell but purgatory, a temporary stop before the soul goes to paradise. He adds up all his sins in a kind of math problem and explains how short a 6,000-year stay in purgatory is compared to eternity. Despite his calculations, Christopher's vision continues to trouble Polly. He goes on to consult his priest, who he complains didn't shield him properly from the effects of his actions. Polly views his church donations as a kind of transaction, that they should morally make up for the effects of his sins. Polly later visits a psychic who he has an extraordinary experience with. Looking past Polly, the psychic appears to consult with the spirits of the dead who skulk around him. He reveals knowledge no one would know, referencing Mikey Palmisi's murder, who was killed in the forest by Polly and Christopher during the war that developed between Tony and Corrado. Angered, Polly storms out of the session, but when recounting the experience with Tony later, he concludes the experience with the psychic was veritable. He concludes the spirit of those he's killed are following him. The above experiences, in addition to Polly's vision of the Virgin Mary and the apparitions of Pussy's ghost, have led viewers to conclude The Sopranos exists in a universe where the supernatural is real. While these otherworldly experiences can sometimes be explained away due to the psychological effects of the characters' Catholic backgrounds, that the psychic had knowledge of Polly's hits from decades before, is hard to come to a scientific explanation of. The above has led viewers to speculate on the meaning of 3 o'clock for Polly and Tony. If it is a message from the other side, as Polly believes, there are a few interpretations. First, it could be Mikey is simply using his situation to agitate his former colleagues as revenge for his murder. Second, it could be a reference to something happening at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. And third, it could be a reference to someone's 3 o'clock, a location slightly behind and above someone. In regard to the last interpretation, it's plausible this is a reference to the last episode of the show. It could refer to the location of the gunman, the man in the members-only jacket, who viewers interpret is Tony's executioner at the end of The Sopranos. Polly ends the series alive, so the show ends before he experiences his version of the 3 o'clock prophecy. Tony's dreams give us access to his subconscious. The dream sequences give us a great insight into his inner life. We see his desires, insecurities, and frustrations, buried in his consciousness like all of us. We see Tony's fear of death and his belief in judgment. We see his wish for continuity, for redemption, and a dream for something more in the material world.